So I feel compelled to ask, so where did that development journey begin? Was it with an app? Like, did you set out to create this instant DB in the platform, or was it more like a product first?
I think it was kind of this idea that was building within us for a long time. So to give context too, I think for us as developers, we started in the era of Heroku and Firebase itself. So I always really admired for Heroku because it let me build things that I didn't, I didn't know how to run Linux containers at the time. So it kind of really opened my eyes, right? So we started with this where I think like developer tools that seem like they're simple for kind of like beginners, they can end up really enabling people to build serious things. And then as time went on, two things kind of happened. One, I think if you develop web apps today, you kind of feel, at least I don't know if you guys relate to this, that there's usually the same kinds of problems that you deal with over and over again. Like you get a database, you write endpoints, you make sure the permissions are there, you funnel the data into the front end, you need to use a store, you think about optimistic updates, right? And and fundamentally, this thing hasn't changed in a long time, right? And I think the closest thing uh, that really addresses this was Firebase for us, where if you use Firebase, you don't have to write endpoints, you can write queries on the front end, everything's reactive by default, it works offline. And what would happen is sometimes, for example, me and my best friend, we work at things like places like Facebook or Airbnb, but sometimes just to move fast, to like show some demo inside Airbnb, for example, we would just spin up a Firebase instance and just show what was possible. So the kind of germ of like it should be easier started there, and then we started building these different startups. And eventually, in one of the startups, we did use Firebase, but the big problem was most systems require relations, right? You need to be able to say a post has a comment and then a comment has a user and give me all the comments for a user. And doing this in Firebase was just such a schlep. We kept seeing this problem. Uh, we even wrote a blog post about it, and then everybody would tell us, why don't you do a business about this? And we said, no, 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 no. That's not a good idea. We're going to do a fitness app. So eventually, as we were building the fitness app, we built some of the rudiments of Instant, and we realized, this needs to exist. Like in the future, there needs to be this kind of tool that you can pick off the shelf that's going to, simplify most of the drudgery that is involved in programming, right? Where actually there's these really fun parts of programming, but I think the kind of repetitive step of take the data, normalize the data, put it in the store, denormalize the data, like we can make that easier.
Yeah, so this seems like a pretty popular topic these days. Just thinking about like the classic app is kind of this three-layer architecture where you have your database, your application backend, your
Mm-hmm.
front end, and translating between all the three is a lot of work, and it's fraught
Mm-hmm.
and non-differentiating. So we've seen a rise of local first frameworks, things that like you just think about your database on the front end or your data store on the front end, you interact with it, and hopefully things are uh,
Mm-hmm.
good. So how do you describe what InstantDB is to
Yeah.
people, and like how does that fit in the local first space?
Yeah. Maybe one way I can also describe this might be getting a little too abstract, but I do think there's this kind of pattern in architectures, and each architecture tries to solve like a different thing. So I'll maybe explaining this, we can just kind of find where instant fits too. So I think one way you can look at what's been happening in programming is, in the 80s, we can go even before the 80s, but let's start with the 80s. You got client software, right? Like you have personal computers for the first time. You install things in your personal computer, um, and you don't really at that in the 80s. Nobody worried about the network, right? There's a famous story. I think it's apocryphal, but somebody asked Steve Jobs, what did he think about the internet or networking, and he took a floppy disk and threw the floppy disk at the person. Said, "That's your network." All right. But around this time, one thing that's interesting is by the 90s, if you look at software like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, it's like the pinnacle of like client software. Like it works really well. Google Docs is arguably not better when you start typing than Microsoft Word in 1998. So it has all these big advantages, But slowly it had these disadvantages, which is one, shipping that stuff takes forever. You have to put it in a box. So you have to have these development cycles, bugs invariably go through. You can't take the data with you anywhere. So, you're kind of tied to your computer. But then 2000 comes along, the internet, and server-based software just, in terms of productivity, destroys the client, right? The data is available everywhere. It's easier to manage. You can ship updates right away. And eventually we get things like Rails, where if you're building an app in Rails, you can go extremely quickly. But the downside of server-based software is that every interaction goes through this middle layer of the server, and no matter how hard you try, it seemed that it wasn't going to be as good as the client-side software. But what ends up happening is Chrome just gets better and better and better, to the point where you can run like 3D animations inside your browser. And suddenly now it's like no longer, the network has gotten a lot better and the browser has gotten a lot better. So you can build a different kind of app. And this app has to work in both places. Like when you see something like Figma, what you realize is it works like a client-side app, but it's also on the network. Everything's collaborative by default. It works offline. Like there's these effects to it that kind of change the style of app. But what ends up happening is when you build an app like that, there's just no fundamental tools for this. So it's extremely difficult to build apps like this. So now to kind of go back all the way to the question that you asked, I think there's different ways that people try to solve this problem. One way is, the Rails approach, where we still stay strong and say, no, like everything should happen on the server. But the problem is this ignores the reality that your browser is really powerful and your machines are extremely good. Then there's kind of this opposite approach where it's extreme, I would say, local first in the original Martin Kleppmann definition of it, where it's extremely privacy centered. It's no central source of truth, right? And that can be very good for things like, secure messaging systems and things like that. But the problem with that is you are starting to get rid of the benefits of the centralized network, where suddenly like those apps, they cannot do things like, they're great for like a single player approach, your own note-taking app. But as soon as you start creating like a multiplayer note-taking app, things start getting very difficult in that approach. So where Instant kind of goes in is a little bit in the middle, where we try to be as pragmatic as possible. Like what we care about is that users can build apps extremely quickly. We want to make it so that within Instant is the fastest way to build an app. But then we want to add the kind of affordances that Firebase had that makes building those apps really fun, right? Like when you build something on Firebase, the app itself is generally better because it is reactive. It does work faster. Optimistic updates come out of view for the box. So I would say kind of Instant is this middle ground where what we're trying to do is to make it really easy to build linear Notion in Figma. And what that kind of involves is some parts local first, where we want to make sure that optimistic updates happen for you. We want to make sure that it does continue working offline. But you want to have some centrality so that you can have shared cursor state. You can solve problems like what happens when many people edit the same thing. How do you kind of reconcile all of that stuff? And that's kind of where we are. I would say another way to say is we're like Firebase, but with relations. Another way to say is we're somewhere middle in this spectrum that I described, but hopefully that gives the context.
Yeah, this is an interesting space. Like you said, you started in the Firebase era. I started in the Meteor.js era. So like all of these new frameworks very much feel like the promise that Meteor.js had. But I think the main difference is with Meteor.js, it was still all backend and just like syncing to the client. There was no concept of that like local first database type thing.
Meteor is really interesting, by the way, because I think Meteor really did, in a way, inspire Firebase, but it also inspired Luna in Asana, which is this kind of like a lesser known, but one of the first players or first frameworks that kind of tried to solve problems in this way. And then Luna was was adopted by Figma, and Figma built a system that looks a lot like that. So a lot of systems literally just originate from Meteor, and and we're still trying to deliver on that promise.